faithfully delivering value by interpreting great books from around the world. Hi, this is Sally here with the Book Talk. Today, we're exploring James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. In 1998, the Modern Library editorial board at Random House selected the 100 best English language novels of the 20th century. Ranked first was Ulysses, and third was A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, both by Irish author James Joyce. The 20th century was arguably the era of modernist novels, and to grasp the innovations in modern fiction, Joyce is simply unavoidable. Compared to Ulysses, often called an impenetrable book, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is the best gateway to understanding Joyce. That's because this novel can be seen as the author's autobiography and is also Joyce's first modernist work. First, I'll outline the plot, then we'll dive into aspects like the autobiographical elements, innovative forms in modern fiction, and stream of conscious techniques to explore this classic. The protagonist is named Dedalus. And then Stephen is a boy from an Irish Catholic family. As he grows, he gradually sheds the shackles of family, religion, society, and his own self, realizing his life's mission is to become a creative artist. The novel is divided into 5 chapters tracing his growth. Chapter 1 covers his childhood from ages 1 to 10. Stephen faces various conflicts within his family, school, and surroundings. This chapter has 4 segments: memories from infancy, a Christmas in elementary school, and an episode where he's unjustly punished at school, but wins an appeal to the headmaster. Chapter 2 depicts scenes of Stephen's lonely growth from 10 to 16, like when he reads The Count of Monte Cristo and obsesses over the heroine, Mercedes. At a dance, he falls for a young girl and mimics the passionate love poems of romantic poet Byron.
However, rejected by her, this love-struck youth sinks into anguish. In a daze, he wanders into the red light district, late at night, and embraces a prostitute, briefly feeling a man's strength and confidence.
In Chapter 3, on the eve of high school graduation at 16, Stephen is tormented by his physical degradation. One day, he hears a priest's sermon, is deeply shaken, and finally confesses, participating in the Eucharist. This chapter is filled with lengthy sermons and prayers, full of oppressive atmosphere. The next chapter, Chapter 4, though shorter, is the key to the entire book, because here Stephen completes his transformation from religion to artistic ideals. Initially, he practiced diligently, lived ascetically, and gained the teacher's appreciation. The headmaster expected him to become a clergy member after graduation, but Stephen gradually realized that he wasn't suited for religious work. In his confusion, he came to the beach, gazing at a waiting girl, and suddenly had a spiritual epiphany, feeling the girl was a symbol of new life, calling out to him. Thus, his blood boiling with passion, he resolved to truly achieve the life he wanted through artistic creation. Well, Chapter 5 is Stephen's complete awakening during his university years, where he fiercely criticizes the corruption and spiritual paralysis of Irish society. He believes that Ireland is a sow that devours her own piglets, and he rejects the narrow nationalism and patriotism prevalent among his classmates. At this point, Stephen's modern aesthetic ideas also take shape, and he ultimately resolves to break through the net and flee far away, choosing exile and art as a life goal. At the end of the novel, he establishes his artistic ideal to forge in the workshop of his soul the conscience that his race has not yet created. This is the novel's general plot, very simple, even plain. But the reason it became a classic lies in the profound meaning behind these simple plots. First, let's look at the novel's content. The protagonist, Dedalus Stephen, isn't appearing for the first time in Joyce's works. This name is imbued with the author's craftsmanship. Daedalus is the skilled craftsman in Greek mythology. He used materials like wax, hemp rope, and bird feathers to make 2 large wings, leading his son Icarus to fly out of the imprisoned maze. But Icarus didn't follow. His father's warning, flying too high, caused the wings to melt, and he fell into the sea and died. And Stephen is one of Jesus's 12 apostles. It's said that while preaching the gospel, he was stoned to death by opponents, becoming the earliest martyr in Christian history. Joyce named the protagonist after two mythological figures to express the difficulty of a young person embarking on the path of art. On one hand, in his growth process, he must overcome resistance from family, religion, and society. He must, like Dedalus, escape from the enclosed, perilous Dublin maze and flee far away. Well, on the other hand, he might also end up like St. Stephen, walking the path of self-sacrifice by adhering to his artistic mission. Additionally, structurally, the novel also imitates Dante's Divine Comedy, with its three middle chapters corresponding to the epic's three parts. Chapter 2 depicts him tormented in the hell of burning desires. Chapter 3 portrays the purgatory of spiritual evolution after confession. Chapter 4 shows him guided by the waiting girl, much like Dante with his guide Beatrice, allowing Stephen to glimpse the heavenly vision of artistic beauty. After a portrait of the artist as a young man, writing within mythological frameworks became a hallmark of Joyce's style. For instance, when writing Ulysses, he similarly used the framework of the Greek epic, the Odyssey, as his narrative thread. In Joyce's era, that mythical world full of mysterious wonders and imagination had vanished forever. Nietzsche astutely noted that modern man, bereft of mythology, still hungrily searches the past, digging for roots. Doesn't this immense historical need in our unsatisfactory modern culture prove the loss of mythic homeland and source? It was precisely this spiritual crisis that drove Joyce to seek and reconstruct mythology, attempting to mend an era of temporal rupture. Thus, it can be said that the obstacles Stephen faced were also a reflection of Joyce's own life. Starting from reality, he made the conflicts between individual versus family, religion, and society, focusing on Irish national flaws, the novel's core theme. To understand this, let's briefly examine Joyce's upbringing. In 1882, Joyce, like his protagonist, was born into a Catholic family in Dublin, part of the ordinary middle class. Joyce's father was a tax collector. Initially prosperous, their fortunes gradually declined, plunging the family into poverty and debt. Joyce transferred from an elite school to one with poorer conditions. Joyce's mother worked tirelessly to raise 10 children. Overworked, she died of illness at 44. As the eldest son, Joyce's mother hoped he would embrace Catholicism and become a respected priest. In 1998, 16-year-old Joyce entered University College Dublin, studying multiple languages including English, French, Italian, Latin, Norwegian, plus theology and philosophy. His exceptional talent drew the Jesuit director's attention. He also hoped Joyce would dedicate himself to religion, but Joyce refused to submit to Catholic faith. Against his mother and the Jesuit director's wishes, he rejected God's call, left Dublin after graduation, and became an exiled artist. From these experiences, we can see that Stephen's story in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is nearly a mirror of Joyce's own life. Now let's examine the Irish society Joyce grew up in. Since the 12th century, Ireland had been a British colony, suffering oppression. Of course, the Irish never ceased their resistance. The most famous was the late 19th century Home Rule movement led by Parnell. But soon, Parnell was betrayed, and the nationalist movement ended in failure. Ireland practiced Catholicism, with a conservative, oppressive atmosphere, poor economy, and layer upon layer of pressure.
Under such pressure, the Irish became apathetic and resigned to the status quo.
In Dubliners, Joyce diagnosed this lifeless, listless phenomenon in Irish society as spiritual paralysis. He said, "Dubliners are the most hopeless, useless, and capricious bunch of slackers I've ever seen." In A Portrait Through Stephen, he states, "When a soul is born in this country, nets are flung at once to hold it back from flight." To break free from these nets and become an artist, Stephen declares, "I will not serve what I no longer believe."
Whether it calls itself my home, my nation, or my church,
I will express myself fully through life or art, defending with these weapons silence, exile, and cunning. These words also foreshadowed Joyce's own destiny. Just like Stephen Joyce permanently left Ireland after graduating in 1902, living in exile abroad, declaring, "Exile is my aesthetic." He longed for a spiritual Irish Renaissance, yearning to discover another country through imaginative literature. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man explores what it means to become an artist. It's not just a personal coming-of-age autobiography, but also a spiritual journey of artists during the Modernist period. Joyce contemplated how young people find their true calling in the complex modern world while writing A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Living outside Ireland, Joyce looked back on his adolescent self as an artist, shaping a symbolic young artist figure. And Joyce's innovative approach to characterization secured his immortal status and breakthrough in literary history. Traditional novels intentionally downplay plot, instead revealing psychological changes through sensory experiences, scene impressions, and inner monologues. This innovation marked a major shift in 20th century fiction, turning the focus from the external world to the psychological realm. 19th century traditional novels, whether Hugo's Romanticism, the Bronte sisters' Gothic fiction, or Dickens and Stendhal's realism, all told stories with intricate plots and dramatic conflicts. They primarily used techniques like character portrayal, scene description, and dialogue recording. The author served as narrator, interpreter, and commentator, guiding readers to understand the characters. However, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man completely overturned this approach. The book lacks captivating plots and suspense, blending joy and sorrow. The narrator nearly disappears. Instead of intense conflicts in typical settings, it presents mundane scenes. It focuses solely on inner feelings, like Chapter 1 centering on an infant's sensory development. Stephen's sensitivity to words, sounds, colors, smells, conversations, and images. Chapter 2 explores a teenager's inner anxieties and spiritual, physical struggles. Chapter 3 depicts Stephen's chaotic consciousness amid extreme guilt and fear. Chapter 4 reveals Stephen's spiritual epiphany process. Chapter 5 shows Stephen's complete awakening through lengthy inner monologues, ending with the protagonist's diary entries. Moreover, while narrating the protagonist's growth stages, it rejects traditional balance and logic, foreshadowing modern fiction's non-linear spatialization. What does non-linear mean? It differs from traditional linear narratives, not recording events chronologically without a complete plot structure like beginning, development, climax, resolution, or causal relationships. There's no way to, in other words, this spatial approach narrates through combinations of scene fragments without excessive explanation between scene transitions and characters' stream of conscious activities. Thus, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man presents a fragmented, uneven narrative style. It's like a pearl necklace where the author removes the string, just juxtaposing pearls of varying sizes, requiring readers to connect them during reading. For example, the narrative time. Chapters 1 and 2 span over a decade, while 3 and 4 cover mere days, lacking transitional explanations between scenes. In Chapter 1's 4 scenes, the first depicts infant Stephen's hazy perception of the world. Then young Stephen, frightened by adults, hides under a table. Next, the novel abruptly shifts to Scene 2, Stephen watching classmates play football in primary school, having conflicts, and being hospitalized. Scene 3, Stephen returns from boarding school for Christmas, only to hear relatives argue over nationalist hero Parnell's death. His young heart was deeply pained. Scene 4. Stephen is struck on the palm by a teacher but bravely appeals to the headmaster, becoming a hero to classmates. This chapter spans a full decade, yet selects only pivotal childhood scenes, making transitions jarringly abrupt. This seemingly illogical juxtaposition differs entirely from traditional novels historically logical linear narratives. Hence, when first seeking publication, it was rejected by Irish and British publishers as too digressive, chaotic, and loose. But to Joyce, in an increasingly diverse, fragmented era, using complete, logically coherent narratives was outdated. Instead, the protagonist's evolving consciousness across stages is shown through narrative perspectives and styles synchronized with psychological changes. The protagonist's growing awareness and emotional development across stages. The novel employs different writing styles in nearly every chapter and section. For instance, chapter 1 begins with a third-person children's story narrative, and his father tells stories and sings nursery rhymes to 2-year-old Stephen, capturing the child's sensory experiences of the world from his perspective. The syntax is simple. Let me quote a passage. Once upon a time, in a good time indeed, a mooing cow came walking down the road, and this mooing cow met a pretty child named Baby Tuckoo. This folk tale of Baby Tuckoo meeting the cow establishes the novel's narrative framework and foreshadows Stephen's future destiny. And if the cow represents Ireland, the motherland, and Stephen becomes the child in this tale, their meeting on the road foreshadows lasting conflict. Through childhood experiences, the novel depicts Stephen's sensory perceptions. Cold bed sheets, his mother's scent, the feeling of wetting the bed, violet and green brushes, hot and cold water from faucets. As adolescence begins, Stephen gains self-awareness. Chapter 2 shifts to realism, with longer sentences and ironic romanticism, showing his struggle between ideals, love, and instinct. Chapter 3 uses rigid religious sermon style. The headmaster's preaching intertwines with Stephen's thoughts, overwhelming his inner voice with relentless dogma. Stephen loses the ability to discern himself. Chapter 4 opens with rich descriptions, shifts to monotonous religious prose midsection, and ends with poetic lyricism. These stylistic shifts mirror Stephen's spiritual conflicts and metamorphosis. B1. He realizes only through artistic creation, harnessing language's magic, can he balance inner passion with external reality. The novel writes, his soul swooned into a new, strange, dim world, as unfathomable as the sea beneath. There, vague shapes and beings moved to and fro. In chapter 5, a maturing Stephen's thoughts turn to philosophical aesthetic reflections, full of speculative depth. Ending with my inner monologue, replacing the novel's opening third-person narration. It also proclaims the establishment of Stephen's self-awareness and artist identity. Here, the linguistic form of the modern novel aligns with the protagonist's consciousness and emotional shifts, achieving unity between narrative form and content. That is, each chapter has varied narrative perspectives, storytelling, length, and thematic development, reflecting the protagonist's physical and psychological growth stages, from simple to complex, naive to mature, confused to independent, from an ordinary child to a future artist. As critic Edmund Wilson noted, Joyce is truly a great poet who invented a new language for human consciousness, akin to the worlds of Proust, Whitman, or Einstein. Joyce's world always shifts with different observers and times, which is why British critic Espelt viewed him as an engineer and inventor among artists. When we mention techniques like inner monologue, sensory impressions, and juxtaposition of memory associations, it's easy to recall common methods in modern fiction. The term stream of consciousness comes from a psychological concept by American psychologist William James. He believed human consciousness isn't pieced together in sections, but flows like a river. Thus, critics categorized novels focused on character consciousness in the 20th century as stream of consciousness fiction. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man isn't a typical stream of consciousness novel, but Joyce developed techniques like epiphany and inner monologue. Joyce used epiphany to reveal characters' spiritual awakenings in an instant. Epiphany, this word originates from ancient Greek, originally meaning manifestation in religion, specifically referring to God directly appearing before humans. However, Joyce transformed the theological epiphany into the spiritual growth of novel characters. He believed epiphany is a sudden intuitive understanding, or a divine revelation, a subtle and precise insight. For ordinary people, it's just a fragment, but contains life's entire meaning. As a manifestation of stream of consciousness, epiphany is a key revelation of a character's subjective world and momentary awareness. In the novel, ordinary daily things or scenes can suddenly become radiant and revelatory in the protagonist's mind. Stephen's growth is filled with countless epiphanies, right? At boarding school in elementary years, when classmates asked what his name meant, Stephen was utterly clueless. Later in the novel, the name Dedalus appears frequently, along with associated imagery like the sea, flying birds, and sky. In Chapter 5, Stephen stands on library steps, gazing up at birds in flight, trying to identify species and understand their flight patterns and calls. Through epiphany about Daedalus's symbolism, Stephen realizes his mission, to become an artist who creates new life from Earth's lifeless materials. Women also served as crucial inspirational figures for Stephen. Eileen was his childhood playmate, while Emma became his first love. Stephen impersonated Byron, writing love poems for her at birthday gatherings.
Lie-defying. While reading The Count of Monte Cristo, the heroine Mercedes constantly appeared in Stephen's fantasies.
By the novel's end, real-life Eileen and Emma merged with fictional Mercedes and the waiting girl into a composite vision. Let's see how the novel describes this. Her eyes had called him. His soul, hearing that call, surged with wild joy. To live, to err, to fall, to triumph, to recreate life from life itself. Before him appeared a wild angel, earthly herald of youth and beauty, emissary from life's impartial court, urging onward. The waiting girl's image passionately called to him, illuminating his understanding. Young Stephen in chapters 1 and 2, facing an incomprehensible adult world, he felt lost, anguished, and wronged. But as Stephen matured, his rational thinking strengthened and self-awareness crystallized. Thus, from chapter 3 onward, through constant reflection, he examined past experiences, decoded life's symbols, and gradually realized his existential purpose and artistic destiny. Therefore, a portrait can be seen as one prolonged epiphany where a young man awakens to his future artist identity. Stephen also embodies all young rebels of his kind. Joyce also employed stream of consciousness techniques, directly conveying characters' fleeting sensations, memories, and associations. And the author does not intervene to explain or comment. For example, in chapter 5 of the novel, Joyce uses the protagonist's diary as the ending, shifting the narrative perspective to the protagonist's most intimate inner world. Let's take a part of the diary and look. March 21st night, free and easy, soul free and easy, imagination boundless. Let the dead bury the dead. Yes, let the dead marry the dead. March 22nd. Went with Lynch to stare at the wound of a burly hospital attendant. Lynch's idea was unenthusiastic, like two starved hunting dogs trailing a heifer. March 22nd. Since that night, haven't seen her figure. Feeling sad, perhaps sitting by the fireplace, mother's shawl over shoulder, but no longer so angry.
Here's a bowl of well-cooked porridge. Do you want to eat now?
Through these inner monologues, we see Stephen, with his artistic temperament, has sentences with strong jumps, lacking logical connections, varying word lengths, frequent omission of subjects and predicates, and imaginative metaphors. And in these narrative methods of Joyce paved the way for the development of modern stream of consciousness novels, not only laying the foundation for stream of consciousness masterpieces, and the birth of Ulysses also influenced modern novelists like Faulkner and Marquez. Faulkner openly acknowledged Joyce's influence on him. In The Sound and the Fury, he used different styles to portray characters' inner worlds and explore their deepest spiritual realms. Beyond stream of consciousness techniques, Joyce employed juxtaposition of scenes, montage transitions, contrasts between daily reality and mythological legends, narrative musical rhythms, diverse stylistic approaches, etc., allowing us to see not only the nurturing and transformation of an artist's soul, but also the formation of Joyce's modern aesthetic theory. Through Stephen, Joyce proposed that art has three modes: lyrical form, epic form, and dramatic form. Using this to examine Joyce's novel creations, Portrait belongs to the lyrical form, Ulysses belongs to the epic form, Finnegan's Wake to the dramatic form. Thus, Portrait, this autobiographical novel, is the aesthetic foundation of Joyce's creation and the starting point for understanding this genius writer. Let's return to the novel's origins. Between 1904 and 1908, Joyce drafted an autobiographical novel titled Stephen Hero, spanning over 1,000 pages. And, dissatisfied, he was about to burn it, but his lover intervened. Nora rescued a portion of the manuscript. In 1909, building on this draft, Joyce broke from realist conventions and employed modernist techniques to complete a portrait of the artist as a young man. And the novel was first serialized in London's The Egoist magazine. It was published as a standalone volume in New York in 1916. After reading it, renowned American critic Pound remarked, "It possessed eternal innovative value, like works by Flaubert and Stendhal." Ironically, while Joyce fought Catholicism lifelong, he created a sacred-like religion in art, where artists became eternal imaginative priests. As biographer John Gross noted, rejecting Catholicism led Joyce to a quasi-theological worldview, art replacing religion, artists becoming saviors. Believing in art's supremacy, Joyce sought to capture time through language, transcending reality and fate through literary imagination. Through labyrinthine linguistic exploration, he pioneered new territories in modern literature. This echoes the novel's epigraph from Ovid's Metamorphoses about Dedalus. With outstanding ingenuity, he forged new realms in art. All right, that concludes our interpretation of Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Reading notes are below the audio. We'll see you next time.